All right, welcome everybody. I'm sure more folks will be joining, but welcome to the January General HANC meeting. Excited to have City Supervisor Aaron Peskin here. Welcome. And Tim Redmond just joined us. Welcome, Tim. We will be discussing some proposed recall reform measure that Supervisor Peskin has put forward, and also be learning a little bit about history of recalls from Tim also. And for the meeting, we're going to be focusing on recall reform and not any specific recalls themselves that are happening right now. But before we go to Supervisor Peskin, just want to open up the meeting for any announcements that anybody has.
So unless someone else wants to announce it, I've got an announcement about the Zoom class action and an announcement about redistricting. So first, on the Zoom class action, there's a settlement pending which will allow anybody, pretty much anybody who's attended a Zoom meeting between March 30, 2016 and July 30, 2021 to share in the settlement. They estimate recovery is $15, which doesn't sound like much, but it is the amount of HANC membership. So I can, yeah, it looks like Kristen put in the chat the link to submit a claim. And for those who are on the telephone, there is a phone number to get a paper claim. It's 1-800-397-3418. So they're estimating $15 to those who have attended a Zoom meeting, and they're estimating the greater of $25 or 15% of your subscription if you had a Zoom subscription. So again, it's not a lot of money, but might be worth doing. Seems pretty painless to submit a claim online. And then the second announcement is on redistricting. The timing seems a little strange, but the focus on District 5 is going to be a week from Saturday, January 22nd at 10 a.m. It'll be on SF.gov TV, although they haven't sent out a registration or a link to join. So those are my two announcements.
Yeah, let me piggyback on what you said, Richard. So the redistricting task force has to come up with final maps by April 15th. And most of this time, they cannot hold anything but virtual meetings, which potentially disenfranchises a certain part of San Francisco or certain parts. And they're going to have at least 2 meetings focusing on each district. So this one will be the first chance for them to hear from D5 residents about how you feel about the current boundaries. How you feel about the neighborhoods that comprise us, what holds us together, what divides us, and give your chance to speak for probably 2 minutes, because while the meeting may start at 10, it will probably run at least several hours, maybe 5 hours, maybe longer, depending on how many people call in. But there will be a second chance, and you will also be able to go to the task force's website and draw a map with their map drawing tool. So when you go on to the city site and you go to the Board of Supervisors committees, the very last committee listed is the task force. So that's how you can find them. And some of us in HANC are working on connecting up with different parts of D5 and talking about how things are working and what we want to advocate. Because D3 and D6 and D10 had such large population growth. You know, this is something we were all saying the last 10 years is the west side is going to have to change because the east side has gotten so many new residents. So there has to be some push and change in other districts, and we're right in the middle. So that's enough for that. But it is something that will matter a lot in terms of our district supervisors through the city and more later.
Great, thank you, Richard and Tess. Are there any other announcements? All right, well, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Supervisor Peskin. Thank you so much for joining us and taking some time out to talk a little bit about your measure, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for the opportunity and Happy New Year, everybody. And I think I saw half of you at various points today, this very day, in different meetings. Thanks for the opportunity. This is the first time anybody's asked me to talk about it. It's not on the ballot yet, but this is election season and it is recall season. In the 20 years I've been kicking around in and out of elected life, there have been a few failed recall attempts. The only one that was mildly serious was aimed at my then colleague. This is a long time ago, Jake McGoldrick in District 1, the Richmond district, but they didn't get enough signatures. And we actually responded by raising the signature threshold. But that was before these crazy days, whether it was the recall or attempted recall of the governor, which works very differently than it works here, which is you have 2 questions on a ballot. But now with Boudin and with the school board, I thought it was worth examining the charter provisions. There are 2 parts to this. One is more technical in nature relative to timing. The essence of the proposal around timing elongates the current law, which says that nobody can file an intent to recall during the first 6 months somebody is in office to 1 year, which to me seems fair and right. You get to, I mean, the voters voted, and then you get to see a year of behavior out of that elected official before you can decide whether they're, you know, crazy or whatever. And it changes, and this gets a little technical in nature, but it changes basically the end of a elected official's period. This applies to the college board, the school board, and actually applies to all elected officials. The how you replace them applies to bodies, but so this would apply to everybody from the DA to the city attorney to treasurer, tax collector, assessor, everybody who's elected in this town. As to the end of their term, you could not file against somebody if there was a general election to replace that individual 1 year away. So basically, you can't have at that position for their first year and their last year, but you can do it in between. This actually would not have affected the Boudin recall, which actually started after he was in office for a year. that is the proposal in a year where we are faced with 4 elections. And I mean, just relative to facts are those are going to be relatively low, if not extremely low turnout elections as compared to when most of these positions are elected, which are generally in presidential or gubernatorial cycles where there are higher turnout and there are more representative, and relative to people organizing and doing what everybody does, whether they're Democratic clubs or other organizations. The notion that you can put any of these things on a ballot at any time, which is why we have counted 4 elections this year, is also troubling. So that is part 1 of the proposal. Part 2 of the proposal, which admittedly is more controversial, and the chief executive of the city, your former HANC supervisor, not HANC supervisor, but District 5 supervisor, our current mayor, doesn't like much, would change the replacement from the mayor appointing not only anybody who is the subject of a successful recall, but anytime there is a vacancy on the school board, community college board, or board of supervisors, it would be the remaining supervisors that appoint to that vacancy. When tragically Wilma Chan died in Alameda County, it was the Alameda County Board of Supervisors who selected her replacement until the next election. This is done in other jurisdictions. It obviously is about, I mean, goes to the balance of power and checks and balances between the executive and legislative, and in this case, school board and college board balance. And it is not final. This has not gone before the Rules Committee. It has not gone to the full Board of Supervisors to be put before the electorate, and we have until the end of February to do that. So that's it in a nutshell. I'm totally open to suggestions. It is going to be the subject of committee hearings and what have you, and this is the first time out that anybody's asked me to talk about it. Would love to hear what you have to say. And just relative to the replacement process, just 2 observations. One is not just political for this time and this board and this mayor. None of us, by the way, are about to get recalled. Nobody's in that position. But I do have a colleague who's running for assembly, and while I happen to be supporting his opponent, I've heard people say, hey, I would like to vote for this person, but I don't want to give the mayor an appointment to the board of supervisors. Well, that's not the world I want to live in. And I've also, I also don't want to have a mayor who's playing political chess about whether they support somebody for something or they support a recall because that mayor has then the power to appoint. So those are just other things that go through my head, but I'm totally open to thinking about it. I'm not married to that. I know it is a pretty heavy duty proposal. And I don't know how it'll fare on the ballot. I haven't polled it, so let's talk about it. And if you want to talk about recology, I'd be happy to talk about that too.
Great, thank you, Supervisor. Yeah, any questions or comments from folks?
Can I throw in a question here?
Sure.
Yes, go for it.
I'm not sure that I know the answer, but I think it's an interesting thing. Aaron, Supervisor Peskin, do you know of any other major city, state, or other large political entity where the chief executive can name members of the legislature?
Tim, I would be lying if I said I did extensive research into this, but there are all sorts of weird things. Like in Marin County, believe it or not, a vacancy on the Marin County Board of Supervisors is actually appointed by the governor of the state of California.
Wow.
Yeah, that's how.
That's even weirder than us.
that's how Katie Sears, who was a great supervisor, she got appointed by Jerry Brown.
Wow.
So I'd be lying if I said I did research everywhere. We're weird because most of the county boards of supervisors in this state don't have a chief executive. They've got a county administrator. and they appoint that, and we've got a mayor, and the reality is I'm really on the city council, not on the board of supervisors. So
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
I want to know how I get my $15 from Zoom. I might get I'll get $15 for just having attended this meeting.
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
No, I see it in the chat. I'm just kidding.
Any other questions or comments?
Calvin, good to see your face.
I'm sorry, Supervisor?
I said, good to see your face, Calvin.
Well, it's good to see you, and I'm, however, saddened that you're still in your office. Don't you have a life, Supervisor?
This is actually my office in North Beach. So this is like my house.
Ah,
I know it's got this little rail, which
Right.
makes you think that I'm in City Hall. And there's actually a picture that somebody actually from District 5 gave me like 15 years ago, which is City Hall with a victory garden from World War II. But I'm actually in my office in North Beach, just a couple blocks from my house.
the question I have is, I believe indirectly related to your proposal, although not directly. I wonder if you've had an opportunity to read Mayor Breed's interview to the New York Times today.
No, but some reporter who I'm not a big fan of from the Chronicle called and said, will you please listen to our podcast at minute 38 for 2 minutes? And she said,
I think you're freezing up a little bit.
she said that, and what do you have to say? I'm trying to be mature in my old age. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
Are you there?
We can now.
Oh, good. I said I don't need to listen to her, quotes or read them. I know where she stands, and I got a job to do, and the whole dynamic of her not believing in the legislative branch of government is not exactly productive. But yeah, no, she's offered meds.
Well, my reading is it's the old assault on district election of supervisors. She jokingly
Yeah, oh,
refers,
absolutely.
she jokingly refers to abolishing the board of supervisors.
I saw it. It's in the Chronicle. Man.
But I believe what she's really talking about is abolishing district supervisors.
Yeah, no, she definitely has been on this trip of I've got a citywide perspective, and all you guys are a bunch of parochial.
Oh, gosh. Yeah.
Which is bullshit. I saw that. I had the exact same thought. Hello? Is that me?
Aaron, you're having some trouble with your connection. It's frozen twice.
Fuck.
Yeah,
You're back now, though.
Oh,
calling in is a good idea.
Yeah, I'm just gonna try an entirely different thing. Wait a second. Hold on, wait a second.
Well, while we're waiting, the reason that it seems to me paired the mayor's assault on the legislative branch, I believe more specifically district election of supervisors, and Supervisor Peskin's measure to make recall a little bit more realistic, but more importantly, try to redress the rather odd situation in our charter, which gives the mayor extraordinary power over legislators or any other office holder. Remember, the mayor can remove another elected official. That happened with the sheriff, our former supervisor, who was removed from office pursuant to the charter by the mayor. We have an extraordinarily powerful mayor. And the amazing thing to me is that people don't realize that we've been operating under a state of emergency for over 2 years. And the mayor then needed a second emergency for the Tenderloin. There's a great deal of talk nationally about the loss of democracy, but very little talk locally. And it just seems to me, since we have both Tim and Supervisor Peskin, and maybe Supervisor Preston later, it seems to me a particularly fraught situation between the executive and the legislative branch. I think all of us have experienced during COVID a diminution of citizen participation before public bodies. The whole question of how decisions are made around closing streets or opening streets. I just wonder if there can be some comments from one, Tim, who has observes this every day, and second, Supervisor Peskin, who lives it every day.
Aaron, do you want to go first? Did we lose Aaron?
I said, go ahead, Tim. I'm happy to, I said, yes, yes, and yes.
Okay, yes. I mean, the extraordinary powers, Calvin says, of the chief executive of San Francisco is a serious problem, not whether you, not this mayor, or whether you like this mayor or don't like this mayor. It's just a huge imbalance. I asked Supervisor Peskin the question earlier because I have looked into this a little bit, and it's hard to find another jurisdiction where the chief executive can appoint members of the legislature. It certainly doesn't happen in the state legislature. It certainly doesn't happen in Congress. If there's a vacancy in the state legislature, as we know, there's a special election. We're going through one right now. That's the same thing with the US Congress. Most county board of supervisors that I'd seen, I didn't know about Marin, appoint their own replacement. Some, as the case with the Alameda County Board, basically make the person agree not to run again. But I don't see that power where a chief executive can essentially remove someone from office pending a supermajority vote on the board of supervisors, and then put in a replacement. Is just tremendous power. Now add into that what Mayor Breed wants is you get rid of district elections, and all of a sudden we're back to the days when a majority and almost a supermajority of the board of supervisors was appointed by the mayor. And yeah, then you had no checks and balances at all. Zero, almost structurally. So yes, I think this is a problem. I also will say though, that every poll I have ever seen in the last 10 years shows tremendous support for district elections in San Francisco.
Yeah. I mean, look, right after you guys or folks in 1996, I guess it was, got district elections back effective 2000. When I first got in office, there was a huge movement to try to get rid of them right there at the get-go. I don't worry at night or in the morning about district elections being vulnerable, even though the mayor is, obsessing about the fact that she's got a teeny tiny bit of oversight in the form of a not super experienced functional board. But I mean, in all fairness to the charter, there is a reality, although we haven't gotten it right on a couple occasions in modern history, which is that the board can appoint to a vacancy in the mayor's office. So, they point to that. London will say, I was elected citywide, so I have a citywide perspective. The 11 parochial district-based supervisors who think not an inch beyond their district border have no business appointing to a district that they know nothing about, because I know all of the districts, because I was elected by all of the districts, albeit by a pretty slim margin. And that I mean, I'm just giving the counter arguments to that. Quite frankly, I say, and I believe it to be true, that my district ends at the San Mateo County border, But I think, I don't want to sound, unprofessional, but I think she's having a little bit of a temper tantrum, even though she has gotten her way. I wasn't there because I was in Mexico City and wasn't about to be staring at the cell phone for 10 hours. But I mean, she got an 8-2 vote, or if you count me as a no vote, because my lack of presence on December 23rd that ran into Christmas Eve relative to ratifying her emergency in the TL. I mean, well, what's she complaining about? But I do agree with you, Calvin. The combination of COVID and Zoom and the emergency has definitely thwarted participatory democracy at everything from the Planning Commission to the Board of Supervisors. Not that mayors ever, reached out to constituents anyway. Happy New Year, everybody.
Thank you, Aaron.
Any
A
other?
little recology.
Recology is actually interesting. I made a comment to some media outlet or another that, and this is an exception to what we were just talking about, that Recology has managed to do what no one else has managed to do, which is unite all 11 members of the Board of Supervisors and the mayor. Wherein, I mean, that, and I'm not making that up. The measure that I introduced on Tuesday relative to structural reform of the rate making process, which Recology sees as the end of the world, was co-sponsored by the mayor and all 10 of my colleagues. I mean, it's obviously crying out for reform. It's obvious. I mean, not only did the 14.6% rate increase that Mohammed Nehru granted them by order pursuant to the 1932 voter approved ordinance, not only did we discover later that it should have been allegedly 7%, which led to the refund to the ratepayers of $94.5 million, a $7 million fine to the city of San Francisco, an additional $23 million fine to the Department of Justice of the United States. But after doing a little more research, it looks like that 7% increase should have actually been a 3.5% increase, as the controller and I have found what looks like another $100 million that they overcharged the ratepayers for. And if you have not been to Costco or Whole Foods or whatever, Recology is out there getting their own signatures on their own ballot measure. How's that for arrogance?
Barry, I see your hand is raised.
Thank you. I've been wondering if any consideration is going to be given in the future to really revamping our whole fee structure for collection of garbage, recycling, and the green bins. I don't know about the rest of you, but every week I get charged for as if 3 full bins are at the curb, whether I have anything there or not. And usually is the case, I've got a half full recycling bin. My trash bin goes out maybe once every quarter. I just don't buy stuff to throw out. I've tried to steer clear of that sort of stuff. And I don't get a lot of deliveries from Amazon and all that. It's just a personal choice not to create a lot of trash. And most of the composting that happens is in my backyard, not through Recology. And so, and my neighbor, very much the same, she lives alone. And it's, yeah, maybe she'll put something out, put her 3 bins out, and there's something at the bottom of the bin, each one of them. But yet, the next door neighbor whose trash is overflowing, it's hilarious. We talk about reducing trash in the city, and there's no incentive for people. It would be wonderful to begin a discussion at some point about how do we really change how we're collecting and charging people, and encouraging people to reduce.
Thanks, Barry. Yes, and I definitely agree. That is a whole topic to discuss and a lot there for sure. I see Tess,
Just in response
please.
to
You're
Barry,
freezing up again.
can you hear? All right, I'll go back to the cell phone. God damn it.
I think you're back now, but you might freeze up again. Then
All right,
Tess,
going back to my out of juice cell phone.
you're muted. Here, I'll ask you to unmute. There you go.
Thank you. So just to Barry, I heard what you said. This would be the first step. This measure not only changes the entire way the rate setting process works, but what is driving Recology crazy is it actually allows the Board of Supervisors and the government to amend in the future without another voter initiative, which is what has kept Recology's monopoly untinkered with for count it 90 years since 1932. So this is the way to get to what you're talking about, Barry.
Thank you. And I see Tess, you got your hand up.
Yes, I wonder if you've shopped this around to some of your colleagues a bit, the recall draft legislation. Some of your colleagues may have been a little upset about spending Christmas Eve on Zoom.
Well, they didn't have to go, not my problem. I mean, if I were the president of the board, I would have told the mayor I'm not calling my people back on December 23rd. So if they're pissed at me, not my problem. But relative to shopping around my charter amendment, no, not really. I shopped around Recology. I assume I have the votes, and I assume people will start engaging as it heads to the Rules Committee on January 24th for discussion. But no, I have not been begging my colleagues for co-sponsorship. But if you support it, tell your supervisors to support it. Or if you don't like it, tell them to oppose it. Or if you think it needs amendments, tell me. I'm totally open to that.
Great. So what's
I
the
like
time?
it.
What's the timeline? Again, sorry if you already
The
mentioned.
timeline is it needs to be, it's a charter amendment. Charter amendments have very cumbersome, as they ought to, rules around them. So the first hearing on this charter amendment will be January 24th, Monday at the Rules Committee. If we amend it in any way, which is possible because the controversial aspect of it is going to require a lot of money to pass, and the mayor will be able to raise a lot of money against it. And I very much remember the drubbing that we took a few years ago when Ed Lee successfully opposed a series of different charter amendments along these lines that would take away mayoral power. But however it ends up, if we amend it, it has to be continued to another meeting of the Rules Committee when, I'm being told that I do have a bunch of co-sponsors on that, including your supervisor, Dean Preston. So there you go. I don't know what I got. What do I got, Lee? Who do I have for co-sponsors?
Yeah, I'm like furiously texting you. You do have a lot of your colleagues jumped on really quickly. I know Supervisor Preston, Supervisor Chan, Supervisor Ronan, Supervisor Melgar signed on, and I want to say Supervisor Walker as well.
Okay, well, I got a bunch of co-sponsors.
Thank you, Supervisor.
Thank you, Lee.
Great. Do we get any other questions? Thanks, Lee, for jumping in too.
Saving me. That's what happens when you got a lot of legislation floating around. But thank you to your supervisor, Dean Preston, for his co-sponsorship.
One quick question, Supervisor. Is there any possibility that ranked choice voting might be rethought through again?
Anything is possible. It's too late to rethink it for June, but you know, people talk about it from time to time. I kind of think that's here to stay too. But it is not in the hopper. No one's rung that bell for June. I mean, the last day to introduce charter amendments was December 14th. For June, the last day for November is sometime in the middle of May.
And iPhone, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I just wondered what the measure is that Recology is pushing, getting signatures for.
So interestingly enough, and Tim and I were just talking about this exact thing earlier today, about a year or so ago, I convened a refuse reform working group that had pretty much everybody who was interested in this on it, ranging from the San Francisco Tenants Union to the Building Owner and Managers Association to the 3 units of labor that work for Recology, the Teamsters, the operating engineers, the laborers, and we looked at, and a bunch of city staff, the controller staff, this committee, the mayor's office participated with their deputy chief of staff. And we looked at 3 high-level options. Tim, you can just turn your thing off and as I repeat this, but we looked at good old competitive bid, which many, if not most, cities and counties do. Municipalizations, which a handful of places, including my hometown of Berkeley, and interestingly enough, New York City does. You know, the government picks up your trash. And what I fondly referred to as the lipstick on a pig option, which was let Recology keep their monopoly and much more stringently regulate it. For a number of reasons, we all landed with pretty widespread unanimity, if not consensus, on a lot of lipstick on the pig. And on or about December 7th, after the city attorney produced a pretty preliminary draft, actually, we took it upon ourselves to meet with Recology, who were not involved in the working group process, as one would suspect, or I think that was what we thought was right. And we gave it to them before our meeting and said, why don't you take a look at this and let's sit down and talk. And on December the 9th, no lawyers, just the Recology CEO, CFO, and somebody from their policy brain trust, and me and the mayor's deputy, Andres Power, met. And they said, well, on the one hand, we really appreciate that you're not kicking us out of town. On the other hand, we're very concerned about this one provision that says that you guys can amend this in the future without going back to the voters, and we want to preserve the voters' rights. And I said, well, not so much, but maybe this can be narrowed. I mean, you know, we're willing to talk. So why don't you guys suggest some language? We're going to break for the winter holiday. Why don't we get together at the beginning of January? And they took our initiative, changed the section they didn't like to say that it could never be amended by the board, not a period, not a comma, without another vote of the people, which is why we've been in this problem, why we've had this problem for exactly 90 years. And on December 20th, they went to the city attorney's office and turned it in for title and summary and are now collecting signatures. So the answer is they are very, very similar initiatives, but the thing we are fighting over is whether or not we can continue to tweak it in the future or not. And their answer is no, and our answer is yes.
Thank you. Thanks for walking through that. All right, well, yeah, thank you, Supervisor.
There's a third version out there that I introduced also, which is the same regulatory structure that is in the mayor, all 11 members of the board version, and is in the Recology version, but it has putting it out to competitive bid on day one. So that's kind of if they go forward with their measure, then the countermeasure is going to be competitive bid.
Good to know. All right, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. And I see we have Supervisor Dean Preston here also, but yeah, thank you, Supervisor Peskin, for taking time out to join us.
Dean, I neglected to acknowledge until reminded that you co-sponsored the recall reform measure. Thank you for your co-sponsorship of that and of the Recology matter, and have a lovely rest of the evening. Talk to you soon.
This is the only way I get to see Aaron in D5 is at a HANC meeting, but and virtually, but I like it.
I was in D5 last weekend. I was in J-Town.
Excellent.
Welcome back anytime. Thank you, Supervisor.
See you guys.
All right, and yeah, welcome, Supervisor Preston. Yeah, thank you too also very much for taking time out to join us. And so we just wanted to give you a chance, as was mentioned, you're a co-sponsor on Supervisor Peskin's measure, so to feel free to weigh in on his measure around recall reform, and also just give you space to give any other kind of D5 updates.
Excellent. Thanks, David. And hey, everyone. And yeah, I caught some of the conversation. It was great to get the update. So I don't know that I have a lot to add on the ballot measures that Supervisor Peskin described, and I think described them well. I mean, and as he said, I'm supporting both of them. You know, I will say particularly obviously recalls have become, you know, a big issue nationally and locally, and I've not been a fan of what I think is really the misuse of recalls, and so I definitely support that aspect of it. But I think equally important in some ways, if not more important, is the issue that he was describing around the vacancies, and that's something that I've felt strongly for a long time, that it really makes no sense to have the mayor, any mayor in San Francisco, have the power to fill vacancies on other bodies, especially on the Board of Supervisors. So that aspect of that measure, I think, is important. It is, you know, certainly something that I hope, you know, this will go through committee in a process, but I'm hoping that both parts of this will remain in the ordinance, because that's been really needed for a long time, and obviously did not prevail the last time it was on the ballot, but I think you know, hopefully will this time around. So I'm happy to, if folks want to talk about those ballot measures, I'm happy to. I'd love to give some just general other updates and things that folks have been asking about, and I'll try to blow through a bunch of stuff fairly quickly, and then to make sure we've got time for questions and comments. And so but let me just, you know, start with I mean, obviously the big thing right now is just the surge that we're in with COVID infections, and you know, really a dramatic surge with Omicron. And so the rolling case average is now up to about 1,600, a little over 1,600 cases per day, and hospitalizations are up to 186 people, which is around the same numbers that we were experiencing during the surge or during the initial in December a year ago. So you know, obviously in terms of like our work, it's like that is just getting the latest information from Department of Public Health, getting that out to people. Things have been evolving on a daily basis. A lot of you probably know about all the problems that Color, which is the vendor the city uses for COVID testing, their whole nationwide had technical issues that put them down for a couple days. So it feels a little like each time we're pushing out info, we're having to recalibrate it, you know, a day later. I would encourage folks, if you're not already on our email list, to please join it, because we've been, Melissa Hernandez in my office has been getting updates out in real time there, as well as on social media. And the other thing has been pushing on school, testing at schools, which we were really behind other jurisdictions that when kids were getting ready to go back to school, the families were getting test kits, even across the bay, like in Oakland, and other cities have, I think, been doing a much better job than we have on that. So hopefully that is changing, or I should say that is changing this week. There's a hearing some folks who are interested in this may want to call in for or watch, which is there's a new committee at the Board of Supervisors on youth and families that Supervisor Ronan chairs, and they are having a hearing tomorrow on testing for the schools. So folks who are interested should tune into that. So, some of the other, just in terms of, I'm trying to think, I try not to go over stuff I've already gone over with you in prior meetings, but a handful of things that we've been working on since the last time I was with you that I want to flag. One is we did an eviction diversion ordinance that the Land Use Committee just this week unanimously recommended to the full Board of Supervisors. And this basically requires a landlord to give a 10-day warning notice before commencing the 3-day eviction notice process. So that means for things like non-payment of rent, breach of contract. I want to point out that, like most decent landlords out there, do this already. They don't just immediately on day 2, when the rent's not paid on, February 2nd, serve an eviction notice, right? Like most decent landlords will say, hey, send the rent in. But we know that, especially with long-term tenants and with some of the bigger landlords or some of the smaller ones who don't want to follow the rules and just want to get folks out, that they use that 3-day period pretty aggressively. So this would insert a 10-day waiting period. That goes before the full board on our next meeting, so a week from Tuesday. One of the other big updates some of you may have seen is that we are now on track to acquire the Gotham Hotel. So that's at 835 Turk Street. And it's the city has legislation now pending to acquire that and convert it to permanent supportive housing. So we're super excited about this. Our office pushed for this, several letters and publicly pushing to get the city to acquire that. This is 114 units of permanent supportive housing if it goes through. And importantly, it's each of the rooms has private bathrooms. They're pretty big rooms. And then there's a community kitchen and gathering area also. So it's really an ideal supportive housing site. That will be before the Budget and Finance Committee this month on January 26th. It would be the first major new supportive housing in our district. And so very excited to have that move forward, and really would encourage folks to call in and support, because there's always going to be people who just knee-jerk will oppose any supportive housing or affordable housing. In District 5, we are blessed with many, many more people who want to embrace supportive housing. And so I just want to make sure folks don't take that one for granted, and please urge you to support or share your views on that. A couple other updates, some related to homelessness, some related to law enforcement, and obviously quite a bit of overlap. Supervisor Peskin referenced this. Quite a bit of controversy at the board and between the board and the mayor around this state of emergency and the emergency order. And, we stood with advocates all around the city pushing back against what I think was really an ill-conceived and just poorly planned emergency order. We had a 10-hour-long meeting that Supervisor Peskin referenced. At the end of that, President Walton and I were the two who voted against the declaration of emergency. I think that and as Supervisor Peskin said, he was not part of those deliberations over the break. But I just think it's really, I commented on it extensively at the hearing. I'll spare you all the details now, but this was a largely a policing plan and a get tough on homeless people and drug users plan, wrapped up with or in promises about service that were really vague, and I think it was just unfortunately not the first time, but just a really unfortunate example of like, there are so many things in terms of addressing the situation of the Tenderloin that would have brought together the Board of Supervisors and the mayor and everyone toward actually solving a problem. And instead it was done in really the most purposefully the most divisive way possible, which is to lead with this as a big, we're going to flood the streets with police, crack down, threaten people with jail, enforce sit lie, all that kind of rhetoric from the mayor. So, there's, hopefully there are good public health interventions as part of this plan, but it was not rolled out as that. And so we're going to have to keep a pretty close eye on what happens in the Tenderloin to make sure it's not just one big massive sweep and one big massive effort to clear the streets for photo ops, and then putting people in jail and then having people right back out on those same streets in the same or worse condition later. So that I think it did expose a lot of differences between the administration and certainly our position, and I think it also I'll let other supervisors speak for themselves, but I will say for myself and as your supervisor, that I think the District 5 office and our positions played an important role in that debate of saying that we should not be addressing crises like mental health, substance abuse, and homelessness through a police response. And it's really sad that it seemed like there was an emerging consensus a year or two ago after the killing of George Floyd and all the a lot of very positive rhetoric in San Francisco that we were moving in a different direction. And I think this latest approach on the Tenderloin is a real huge step backwards on that front. A couple other things on law enforcement, just to update folks. We did, I voted against the proposal to expand the basically contracting out of policing program. Right now, police officers can basically be hired for certain functions and special events. Asha Safai did legislation to expand that to sheriffs as well. And also what we have really uncovered through the debate on this is that a program that was originally designed for special events, basically so that a police officer, police officers could be hired for like a funeral procession or a Warriors game or something like that, and paid for by a private party, is instead being put out there as a solution to anytime there's a need for any kind of policing. So Safai proposed this as basically for Walgreens and all the retail theft, basically was saying, hey, you should have you should have sheriffs and hire sheriffs. And so, it was an expansion of the law enforcement footprint. It's also, I believe, illegal under state law. I voted against it, and we're going to have to really see how that program is implemented. The other thing we did was introduce an ordinance to start addressing what is a huge backlog of public records that are supposed to be disclosed by SFPD and by the Department of Police Accountability. We are on target to be decades behind schedule in releasing files that the state has made clear that police departments are supposed to release. So we introduced legislation to try to get that moving. And then I guess the last kind of topic area I wanted to give you a few updates on that I know is of interest to many of you are transit. And we've talked extensively around like our fight as an office to get back all these lines that were suspended with no timetable for return. It's been a a year, almost 2-year battle to even to get some of these lines back. And that includes the 6, obviously, which is directly relevant for the hate. Also on the other side of the panhandle, the 21. And so the good news is we got commitments from MTA to bring all these lines back, and that was adopted by the MTA board. And that was not the plan. There was no commitment to bring these back. So I want to thank all of you who took action on that, because it took like really folks rebelling against the approach that MTA was taking and demanding lines back. So almost all the lines are back. There's only a couple citywide that, I'm sorry, almost all the lines are now promised to be back. I think we're gonna have to stay on MTA. Obviously, the spread of Omicron is not helping in terms of more operators being out and slowing that. But we're looking at, it was originally February. I think it'll probably get pushed to March. But getting back all the lines in D5, the 2, the 21, the 6. And the other big one for the hate that you may have seen is that we're trying to do on Oak Street what we did on Fell with the quick build bike lane. So there's on Fell the bike lane that basically we moved the parking lane out and created a bike lane there. And worked with MTA on that early in the pandemic. And we're trying to do the same thing on the other side of the panhandle. And so we secured some funding for the design and implementation of that, and are trying to get that going as quickly as possible, and trying to get it done definitely in this calendar year. I think that's it. We also did a resolution to ban parking in bus stops. I was amazed to learn that almost 1,000 bus stops in San Francisco have legal parking. We're not talking about people like illegally pulling up and parking. We're talking about a bus stop that has cars parked in it. And so you have to cross, I mean, it's just nuts to me. But anyway, so pushing MTA, we did a resolution that passed unanimously on that. So we're gonna try to get them to just paint the damn curbs red, and so that people don't have to navigate through parked cars to board their bus. So I think there's probably a million other things, but I also want to make sure there's some time for questions and comments, and looking forward to hearing from everyone.
Thanks, Supervisor Preston. Yeah, for all that info. I see a couple questions in the chat. Maybe Bruce, you can see a couple are from you if you want to just ask. Get your hand raised.
Hey, Dean, how are you?
Hi, Bruce.
I was wondering if you might talk a little bit about AB 854.
Sure, the LSAC bill?
Yeah, that had a huge amount of endorsements and support at the hearing yesterday.
Yeah, it's so that's a bill. Some of you may remember back in 2014, we tried to do this when I was doing a lot of work at Tenants Together in Sacramento, and Mark Leno at the time championed this LSAC reform bill and did heroic work on the floor of by one vote, got it out of the state Senate, and then only to land in the Assembly Housing Committee where they killed it. That Democratic supermajority is not worth much when it comes to tenant rights in Sacramento. But anyway, it was reintroduced, or a similar bill last year, pretty much the same bill. The idea is most LSAC evictions happen in the first year when a real estate speculator buys the property. The whole theory of the Ellis Act, I mean, personally, I think it should be repealed. But even if you're going to make a case to keep it and that there's a function for it, the only case is that there are longtime property owners who, for whatever personal reasons, may not want to be landlords anymore. They may, and that the Ellis Act gives them a way to not be landlords anymore. The practical use of the Ellis Act is that's almost never what happens. Like, you never see the landlord, they've been landlord for 40 years, now they're retiring, they've got 1-2 rental units, and they invoke the Ellis Act so they don't have to be landlords. That's just not how it's used. It's used by real estate speculators who buy the building with a plan to kick everyone out and convert them to TICs or condos. And there's great data, tenants unions done great work, and anti-eviction mapping project and others, showing this and showing that it's huge. It's like half of the, more than half of the evictions happen in the first year. Most of them happen in the first 6 months. And then if you look in the first few years, I don't know what the current number, it used to be about 75, 80% of LSACs in the first few years. So the idea of AB 854, Assemblymember Alex Lee's bill, is to say you can use, landlords, you can use the LSAC, but only when you've owned property for at least 5 years. So it's like a holding period. And basically saying these speculators, you don't get to come into the landlord business and then immediately say, I'm going to use the state law to kick everyone out because I don't want to be a landlord. Like, if you don't want to be a landlord, don't buy a building full of people in it, right? I don't, that's going to require, it's going to be a huge fight in Sacramento, but it was a 2-year bill. If a 2-year bill is the way the legislative cycle works in Sacramento, and if it doesn't pass in the first year, right, and you're going back in the second year, so now we're in the second year of the legislative session, you have a January deadline to move those bills out of the first committee, and that moved through that committee. So it's got to go through appropriations, it's got to go to the floor. It's not a done deal, but it's a big step, because this was the committee, the Assembly Housing Committee, that killed it 5-6 years ago.
Right. We have a question from Calvin. Will there be any chance for residents to participate in the development of the Oak Street bike lane? And will the current pedestrian only use of Oak Street Panhandle path be maintained from Baker to Stanion?
I believe so. So yeah, there aren't even the designs yet on the Oak Street bike lane. So as those come out, we'll definitely share those and get input on those. So there'll be an opportunity to participate in that. So I don't think there will be a change to the pedestrian use in the Panhandle. One of the benefits of these lanes that are outside of the Panhandle on the street is that the faster moving bike traffic moves to that. And I think that would definitely be the case on Oak, especially because Oak's more downhill. So, part of it is getting some of those faster moving bikes out of the Panhandle and out of the bike path, right? That's there. And we've seen that, and MTA has some data on this because we've been monitoring the Fell one pretty closely. Of a lot of relieving the bike path on the north side by moving some folks into Fell. So I think we'll see the same, but I don't anticipate any changes on the pedestrian, on the south side path. I think what's tricky is that first block, and what I want to see from their designs, what the solutions are for that Stanion to Schrader.
But there also has been some concerns about the balance of pedestrian safety. If we're going to have a fast moving bike lane, that if there's no traffic control at the crosswalks and bikes are, allowed to just breeze through a red light, so to speak, how will that be dealt with? I mean, how is it being dealt with on the Oak Street side?
Well, on Fell,
Fell Street side.
I mean, I gotta say, I think Fell has been a real successful model. I mean, we met repeatedly with the fire department, because there are a number of things we're balancing, right? There's the pedestrian safety issue, the bike safety issues, what it does to traffic, and then what it does to first responder response time, right? And so we had, and our work on Fell has sort of been cited by MTA and others, like in other areas, as sort of a really good model of collaboration. Like, we had 4 periodic meetings basically with fire, MTA, and looking at actually the data on, on the usage, on the speeds. So, and MTA has been a pretty good partner actually on assessing and bringing together that data. So we have, the tricky part is the mixing lane on Masonic. That is an area for the cyclists. That's an area of concern, right? Anytime you have people turning through a bike lane, we have not had bike pedestrian conflicts as feared, but that is the concern you're raising of increasing potentially the speeds and so we haven't seen those conflicts, but we have, definitely have been watching for that because it's something that has been raised as a concern. And I agree that on the Oak side, because it's downhill, in the same way that the bike path, I mean, folks fly down that path in the Panhandle, right? So, and there are no lights or anything to really regulate it. So, you do have the advantage that.
Supervisor, I'm in the, oh, sorry.
Go for it.
Okay, I'm in the Panhandle twice a day between Ashbury, well, Masonic and Stanion in the morning and the afternoon. I don't know what SFMTA has told you about the use of the Fell Street side, but most bicyclists still stay on the northern path. There is still, both in the AM and in the PM, the vast majority of bicycle travel in the Panhandle is on the path, not in the lane. But the question is crossing the street when it is no longer enforced that bicyclists stop at stop signs or lights. And that is especially true in the Fell Street bike lane. The bike lane goes regardless of whether or not it's a red light or a green light, which is okay, except if you're on the curb trying to cross the street. It is an issue. But the Oak Street side, I couldn't agree with you more. The interesting thing is going to be, how is the transition made from Stanion to Schrader? And I will bet you the way the transition is made is that bicyclists will take the northern pedestrian or the southern pedestrian path. That is the safest way to cross the street, to cross Stanion Street.
Yeah, so we would push back on that. So, I'll take the concern back. I do think that the concern around the speeds, on the Oak side and pedestrian conflicts is a real one. So I'll talk to MTA about that and see what their ideas are. And I don't disagree that there's, I've been out there quite a bit, and that on the westbound side,
as well.
There's more folks, in the Panhandle than on the lane. But I will say that you do see the lane on the street does get used. It does relieve some of the faster moving traffic. So like the folks, especially in electric bikes and others. So so I think it's a fair concern around the Oak one, especially with the downhill.
I'd like to interject as well, please.
Okay, go ahead, Louise.
Yeah, I totally agree with Calvin. I cross the Panhandle from Fell residential over to the Panhandle several times a day, including weekends, and one has to stop and peer around the parked cars to make sure there's not a bicycle hot wheeling it down the street lane that's been put up. They do not stop for lights. They have no intention of ever stopping for lights. And they will want the Oak Street side to be next to the Panhandle so that they don't have to stop for the cross streets that feed onto Oak Street. The elderly people who live on Fell Street never were given an opportunity, nor were the parents of small children who have to step around in front of their stroller to see around the cars, make sure there's not a bike coming before they take their child in its stroller the rest of the way across the street. None of the residents were ever given a chance to comment on the existence of that temporary bike lane when it was put in. And it's certainly not the way you're talking about it. It's not a temporary thing. Supposedly, they needed a temporary lane because there was so much traffic on the Panhandle path that is used by both bikes and pedestrians. When the pandemic first summer came along and people had more free time. And I do not trust, as a pedestrian, I do not trust the Bicycle Coalition. They have no one's interest in mind but their own. And anybody that thinks different or acts different, if you try to cross a bicycle lane when they're coming down the street, they're going to scream at you. You've never seen a pedestrian hit a bicycle and kill the bicyclist. You've seen bicyclists hit and kill pedestrians. Not as many as cars, but they are less likely to follow the rules of the road than the cars are. End of my tirade.
Thanks. So we will, so I'll circle back with the MTA, and also it'd be good to chat with Walk SF about this. I do want to point out the one thing that came on the Fell Street side, not the primary purpose, but certainly one of the benefits that we're hoping to get out of the bike lane there is there's been a significant speed reduction on Fell of the cars. And so I just want, like, that has to be part of the mix, because it's in considering the benefits here, because by having one less lane, and I can get folks the data if they want it, but we did see a reduction in speeds without having congestion. So that's a positive, and we all know that speed reduction in terms of severity of injuries and fatalities, that reducing speeds is the number one thing that we can do. So that's in the mix too, but happy to try to to circle back with MTA and our friends at Walk SF, and to make sure that we're safeguarding pedestrians crossing the bike lane.
Thank you. Yeah, we appreciate that and look forward to engaging in the community process around that proposal and design. I'm just going to touch on quickly a couple follow-up questions that were in the chat. One was, will the 21 line return going all the way downtown?
So initially, no. And I would say this is an area I really would urge people to speak out on. We pushed very hard in committee on this. So my top priority was getting lines restored, because I think that the unstated plan, or at least the trial balloon, was they were trying to see what lines they could get rid of. And I think it's a lot harder to get rid of a line when it's running than when it's been suspended for a year or two. So I felt very strongly that even if we didn't get a line fully back because of, MTA says they don't have the staffing and the operators to operate all the lines at full routes and full capacity. So I was more open to, I was very clear we needed these lines back. The 6 is being restored to its full route, but will have lower frequency. The 21 the frequency is not bad, not pre-pandemic, but not as bad as the 6, but they're running it down basically to BART. We think we have to be very careful that, like I have made clear, that is one thing to do that as a short-term thing, especially when so many offices are still closed and not operating downtown and so forth. And when you have an operator shortage, it's not okay to just lop off the end of that route. We have to make sure this is not, that they don't try to keep it that way. So I've made clear to MTA that we want the full line back, but it will take, if they push back on that, after there's this initial stage where we just get the partial line back. And then the question is, as the resources become available to extend it, do they or not? And do they try to make this shortened line permanent? So they haven't taken a position one way or the other on that. On the other lines where they're promising to bring them back, but they'll be at lower frequency, they've made clear that that is a temporary thing, that as the resources, come back and they have more operators, that they will restore the frequencies, right? But on the shortened lines, they haven't. But look, we've fought on some of the others. Initially the 43, was back, but not full line. They've committed to bring that full line. So this is absolutely one of the areas where speaking out, it shouldn't be this way. We shouldn't have to battle with our transportation agency just to get them to, to run the buses that we had before the pandemic. But that's been the dynamic, and it's been the organizing and the united calls for all these lines coming back is the only reason they're coming back. So, I mean, I'll give the MTA credit that when we were all loud enough, they listened, right? So, I mean, that's the positive. But we shouldn't have all had to put so much time and energy into fighting with the MTA just to get back basic lines. But no, the 21 will come back not all the way down to the ferry building, but down to the BART station.
Thanks. Yeah, definitely agree. Needing to keep pushing to get that full service restored. And now I'm going to go to Harry just for our last question.
Yes, with it next week on Wednesday before the Budget and Appropriations Committee, there's going to be a new contract, which essentially hand over the Japanese tea garden and the Conservatory of Flowers, both of which were formerly free to everyone, and the conservatory more recently than the tea garden, which started at 50 cents a person, and they want to charge $13 on weekends. That was congestion pricing that was terminated last year. And also they want to have the Botanical Garden Society control both the tea garden and the Conservatory of Flowers, in addition to the Arboretum, and everyone should go see what they've done in the Arboretum, cutting down trees, putting up gated facility around the new greenhouse they're building. They have a huge area on top of the hill. It's not being used. And if you turn to the right, they turned what was a nice, pristine demonstration garden into a so-called celebration garden where they have corporate events. So that's the plans for the tea garden and the conservatory. I think that there was $1 million plus deficit. So the Conservatory of Flowers was not profitable during COVID for Parks Alliance and trying to unload it onto the Botanical Garden Society. But I just wanted to ask Dean Preston about his views about congested pricing and charging people more on weekends when we should have a free day. The free days are never times where people can come. That's a big problem, and there shouldn't be free days anyway, because every day should be free with a $12 billion budget. But thank you very much.
Thanks, Harry, and thanks for your advocacy on it. And I can't respond around the details of. I saw the mayor's press release around that proposal. If we're talking about the same thing,
Yes.
Which is free for residents, right?
Yes.
I have not reviewed the legislation. It comes before. I'm not sure if it comes before the full board or to the budget committee. I think it's to the budget committee.
Yeah, and then the full board.
Yeah. So I have not, I haven't looked at it. I did notice in the press materials on it that I thought it's striking in its contrast to her treatment of free muni, just that, she's talking all about how important it is for.
Well, but notice our guests are not free. So that's the catch.
No, I understand, but even.
Yeah, I know, but it's clever.
Yeah. No, I hear you. And I know you've raised this issue before around free for residents versus free for everyone. And then the issue of what happens to residents who don't have the documentation they need right at the time that they're going in. So I know we've discussed this. I'm happy to, I'm happy to take a look at it and give you my thoughts once.
And your speech about the Tenderloin, by the way, was great at the end around 11:45. I like that a lot.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Harry. Yeah, all right. Thanks so much, Supervisor Preston, taking time out of your evening to come and chat with us and give us updates. Yeah, appreciate you being here. And saw Jenbo here also too.
Yes, I
So
should have
thank you
mentioned.
for
Yeah,
coming.
Jembo has been on, and thank you for keeping her and our office up to date on everything, and wishing everyone a happy new year. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Dean. And we're not done. We got more to go. We're super lucky to be joined by Tim Redmond with 48 Hills. We asked him to come speak a little bit about history of recalls and give some kind of historical context to the conversation we're having before. So thanks for being here, Tim. I'll pass it to you.
Thanks so much, David, and thank you all for sticking it out and listening to me. I won't go on for too long because it is late, but I think there's some very important context to understand when we look at the recalls that are happening now, particularly the school board recall and the Chesapeake recall in San Francisco, but also other recalls in the state and around the country, and what's actually driving them, because it's a really interesting piece of history, and I would say kind of an abomination of the original intent of the recall. So let's remember the initiative of the recall and the referendum were creatures of Hiram Johnson, the progressive era governor in 1911. Back then, we have to remember, Southern Pacific pretty much ran the state of California. Later, PG&E and a few others joined in. But Hiram Johnson was elected on a platform of breaking control of a few big corporations on the state. And at that point, a lot of people felt like you couldn't get anything done through the state legislature because the state legislature was wholly controlled by Southern Pacific. And so you couldn't, and later on Standard Oil and a few others, but you couldn't get anything done. So the idea was, okay, if our state legislators who got elected with the support of Southern Pacific can't be counted on to do the work of the people can do it themselves. So we can put an initiative on the ballot with signatures and we can pass our own legislation that the legislature is too corrupt to pass, right? And at the same time, if the legislature, controlled by Southern Pacific, does something really horrible, we can put a referendum on it, we can put it on the ballot, and we can get rid of it. Added to this was the recall. And the idea of the recall was, if you get someone in the governor's office or the state legislature, particularly the state Senate, which had longer terms, who turns out to be completely corrupt, we should have a way to get rid of them before the end of their term. That was the idea, to get rid of people who were completely corrupt. One of the first successful recalls was a state legislator from Marin, I believe, named Marshall Black, who was convicted of embezzlement and refused to resign. This is now 1913, 1914. So the people took it upon themselves to remove that person from office because he had been convicted of embezzlement and refused to resign, right? Immediately after this passed, there was 3 or 4 major recall attempts in 1913, 1914, 1915, mostly of state legislators, all right? And the guy named Edmund Grant, who represented San Francisco, was successfully recalled because he led a campaign against prostitution and tried to close down houses of prostitution in San Francisco, which was a very unpopular position at that time by the people of San Francisco who recalled him from office. But generally, there was a flurry of recalls, mostly around this idea of corruption, that qualified for the ballot. Few state legislators were recalled, and then there were none until the 1990s. Right? There were lots of attempts. There were, I believe, 5 or 6 attempts to recall Governor Culbert Olson, who was a strong progressive, who actually he tried to get universal health care in California in the 1940s. He supported Upton Sinclair's End Poverty in California campaign, right? And so the more conservative forces who didn't like him tried to recall him. But you know what? They never got the signatures. And there were, they tried to recall Pat Brown 4 times. They tried to recall John Burton. They tried to recall Willie Brown. They tried to recall Jerry Brown. They tried to recall Ronald Reagan. There were all these recall efforts, and none of them got the signatures. But let's remember, this was all happening before the advent of paid signature gatherers, which didn't really become a thing in California until the 80s and 90s. Right? So basically, we didn't see any of these qualify. Until 1994, there was an attempt to recall David Roberti, who was the president pro tem of the Senate. And there were two aspects to that that are interesting. And one, we'll come back to this in a minute, becomes really relevant. Roberti passed a strong gun control law. He had his name on it, and he passed a strong gun control law in California in 1993. And the gun folks, the Second Amendment gun advocates, managed to get the signatures to try to recall him. There was another force at play there too, which is really significant. We all know what the Costa-Hawkins Act is. The Costa-Hawkins Act basically bans cities from having effective rent control. We cannot have rent controls on vacant apartments, right? That was passed in the mid-1990s. Right? What had happened was, starting in the early 80s, I think 82 or 83, in some cases the late 70s, Berkeley, Santa Monica, and West Hollywood all passed laws that controlled rent on vacant apartments, which basically meant the apartment rent was set, and then when you moved out, the next tenant paid the same rent, which of course got rid of the incentive for landlords to evict longtime rent controlled tenants because they couldn't raise the rent. The landlords were furious. They went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, a case named called Fisher versus Berkeley that I'm sure Supervisor Preston, you're familiar with. The United States Supreme Court, after the state Supreme Court shot them down, the US Supreme Court shot them down and said, this is within the rights of cities to make this legislation. Having failed in the courts, they went to the state legislature, and every year, Dominic Costa would get this bill introduced. Every year it would pass the state assembly. Every year it would pass through, and this was going for like 10 years. Every year it would pass through the state Senate committees. And every year David Roberti, the president pro tem of the state Senate, would refuse to calendar it for a floor vote. Every year he single-handedly killed that and preserved rent controls on vacant apartments. And I actually talked to him a couple of years ago about this. I called him about something else, and we were chatting about it. And he said, you know, it wasn't going to happen on my watch. I wasn't going to let that happen on my watch. And so, you know, Willie Brown let it go through the assembly, although he voted against it, but he never stopped it from going to the floor. David Roberti did. So between the gun advocates and the landlords, they got David Roberti recall on the ballot, and he survived it. But he then, of course, succumbed to term limits, which is why the Costa-Hawkins bill eventually passed, because David Roberti was the only one who was able to stop it in the legislature. Anyway, so that one was not successful. However, so then the Republicans, around that same time, 94, 95, take control of the state assembly. And Willie Brown has been the Speaker of the State Assembly for a very long time. The Republicans take control and decide they're going to replace him. Not surprising, he's a Democrat. Willie was a consummate political operator, whatever else you say about him, and he convinced one Republican. It was basically a 51-49 situation. He convinced one Republican, a guy named Paul Horcher, to stick with him. Paul was really mad at the other Republicans. He was a moderate Republican. He didn't think they treated him well. They didn't give him the committees he wanted, whatever. He was the one Republican who voted to keep Willie Brown as Speaker. And it succeeded. For 2 years, Willie Brown stayed in as Speaker in a Republican-controlled House, and Paul Horcher was recalled. Right? A short time after that, after Willie Brown was not able to maintain, a Republican was elected, he then convinced another Republican named Doris Allen, who was a moderate Republican, to run for Speaker, and all the Democrats supported her. But Willie, of course, in the background still had a lot of power. She was recalled. Right? Now we're starting to see recalls that are based not on corruption, not on malfeasance in office, not on embezzlement or graft or anything, but recalls based on, we don't like the way that person voted in office. And rather than waiting 2 years, in the case of the state assembly, to vote someone else in, we're going to get rid of them right now. Right? And we also started to see big money come into recalls. Right? We started to see money from, as I say, the gun lobby and the landlords, and later the right wing of the Republican Party start coming in, and we started seeing paid signature gatherers. So it really changed the entire thing. All right. There was another one, another state legislator, Josh Newman, was recalled in 2018 because he voted in favor of gas taxes. Right. So this is no longer getting rid of somebody who was embezzling. This is no longer getting rid of somebody who's in the throes of Southern Pacific and is corrupt. This is now, I don't like the way you voted on an issue, and rather than run against you, we're going to do a recall. Now, why is that successful? Why has it been successful with Republicans? Because recalls are low turnout elections. They're special elections. And if you can't get your person elected in a regular election, or you don't think you can win, you do a special election. And really what we found with recalls is the people who vote in special elections, as we all know, are the ones who really, really care. And the average voter who may not be plugged into whether Paul Horcher voted for Willie Brown for state assembly and may not care that much, doesn't come out to vote. Right now, let me shift back a second, because sometimes these things have unexpected consequences. Let me shift back to 1983, because this is really important. 1983, Dianne Feinstein is mayor of San Francisco, and she is in serious political trouble, right? Dianne Feinstein's ratings in the polls are down. People are unhappy with the direction of the city, particularly with all of the overdevelopment. Going into late 92, or late 82, early 83, a lot of pundits are saying, gee, someone could actually beat Dianne Feinstein for mayor. She hasn't been mayor that long. She came in after the killings of Moscone and Milk. This is essentially was appointed mayor by the supervisors for 1 year and then ran and got reelected in 79. She might be in political trouble. Okay, completely aside from that, two things happen. Feinstein signed a very strict San Francisco gun ordinance, all right? And that really angered a group, some of you will remember this, called the White Panthers, who had a house in the Haight. And the White Panthers were radical left gun lovers, right? They were radical, some type of communist sect and I don't know whether they were Marxist Leninists or whatever they were, but they were a hard left sect that loved guns and that believed they all had to have guns to protect them from the police. Right? They also did some cool stuff. They ran the food conspiracy, which was a way to get really cheap food in the Haight for many, many years. But anyway, they announced they're going to recall Dianne Feinstein over the gun issue. This would have gotten nowhere, except the same week that they filed the recall, Dianne Feinstein vetoed Supervisor Harry Britt's first domestic partners ordinance, which would have allowed LGBT city workers to get health insurance from the city. In other words, it would have said, if you can't get married, but if you are a domestic partner of a city worker, you can get city benefits, which really doesn't seem like such a radical idea right now. But it was a radical idea back then. We would have been one of the first cities in the country to do it. And Dianne vetoed it, even though it passed the Board of Supervisors. This infuriated the entire LGBT community, right? The second thing she did is she vetoed a resolution by Supervisor Nancy Walker declaring Reproductive Rights Day in San Francisco because she said it was too divisive. Right? Those two things infuriated women all over the city and the LGBT community. So when the White Panthers started walking around with recall Dianne Feinstein petitions, people signed them. And although this was originally about guns, it became about LGBTQ rights and about reproductive rights and a lot of other stuff. And people were really mad at Dianne Feinstein for a lot of reasons. She was not popular. So they get this on the ballot. It qualifies, right? It qualifies in early 1983. There's going to be a special election in the spring of 83. There's a regular election in the fall of 83 when she would have been on the ballot, but the White Panthers weren't going to wait. Under Supervisor Peskin's ordinance, they wouldn't have been able to do this. Right? So Diane's husband goes around to, who's a very wealthy investment banker, goes around to all of his friends and says, this is very destabilizing for the city. We can't have the mayor recalled. And they all agree. So then the Feinstein campaign went to, I believe, the state attorney general's office and got an opinion that a recall election is not about a candidate, it's an initiative, so there's no limits on contributions. That's the first time this had ever come up, right? So somebody asked before, can we limit campaign contributions and recalls? The Attorney General's Office of California has said, no, you can't, because it's an initiative question. Should we recall the mayor? It's not a candidate question, right? This has made a huge, huge difference ever since then. And it was Feinstein's recall that they did this, right? So Feinstein then hired a guy named Fred Ross Jr., who was a very smart campaign organizer trained by the Cesar Chavez Farm Workers Organization. And he put together a whole grassroots operation with unlimited money from Feinstein's friends, $10,000 from PG&E, which back then was a huge amount of money for any campaign, $10,000 from Chevron, right? Big chunks of money from, and they organized a campaign where they put the whole recall on the White Panthers. And they went around and said, do you want to vote for this White Panther recall about gun control? And Dianne won. The recall was 70% of the vote. And it made it impossible to challenge her in the fall. Everyone walked away. How can we? She just got 70% of the vote. So that recall essentially made Dianne Feinstein impossible to challenge. And of course, we all know the rest is history. She's now in the United States Senate. Right? So That's what can sometimes happen with recalls. Now we're looking at recalls in San Francisco. The school board recall has, I believe at this point, $1.1 million behind it from some very wealthy conservative Republican donors, many of them people who support charter schools and who, all right, the recall was put on by people who are mad about Lowell High School, and they're mad about the renaming of the schools and the fact that the schools were not open during COVID. I'm not going to get into arguments about those things right now. That's not the point. The point is the money isn't coming from anyone who cares about whether Lowell is a lottery system or you have to test into it. The money's coming from people who like charter schools and want to see more privatized schools. Calvin says, the Panthers were not leftists in any way. They believed in people's enterprises, not social ownership. People's ownership is to the left as National Socialism is to socialism. Okay, Calvin, you know them better than I. I am not going to disagree with you. I do know that they define themselves as leftists, and they also had a lot of guns, and they defined themselves as Second Amendment people. So I apologize for my mischaracterization of the White Panthers. Nevertheless, I think my analysis of that recall and the implications of that recall are accurate, that this is where the big money started in recalls. $1.1 million from people who, again, why would some of these out-of-town billionaires care about a school board race? Because all around the country, they're trying to push an agenda of privatizing public schools, right? The same thing with the Dean Preston recall, right? Dean Preston is being recalled because, not Dean Preston, sorry, District Attorney, Chesapeake Dean. Dean Preston is not being recalled. The Chesapeake Dean recall is happening. I was just looking at Dean's name up here. The Chesapeake Dean recall is being funded by large amounts of Republican money, right? And a lot of people who don't really have any connection to San Francisco politics, but they don't like the idea of a progressive DA in San Francisco or in any other city, right? So these recalls got on the ballot. Remember, the school board recall, the Boudin recall failed the first try. They couldn't get the signatures, right? They could not get the signatures go on the ballot until the big Republican money came in, and then they could pay signature gatherers. I think somebody commented that the Recology has signature gatherers out there who one guy made $10,000 in a week. They're getting paid $10 or $15 a signature, right? With that, one consultant told me you could put an initiative on the ballot to ban ice cream in San Francisco, which would be paying people $15 a signature, right? So all of this is to say, the recalls that we're seeing now really have nothing to do with the original intent of the recall initiative and referendum. I think Hiram Johnson is rolling over in his grave every day when we see these big money campaigns take over the initiative and the referendum and the recall, because it was supposed to be about people power, not about big money power. But California is so big now, it costs so much to run a campaign. And in order to get these things on the ballot, you need to pay signature gatherers. So that's where this has come in. Right, I'll stop there, it's late. I hope that this is helpful to you in understanding these recalls and why we're having these recalls, why we're seeing them around the country, and why so much big money is going into them. And you can thank Dick Blum and Dianne Feinstein for opening that door, although somebody else might have done it.
Thank you, Tim. Do you have time for
Sure, of course.
comments and questions?
Of course.
Great. Any folks have any questions or comments for Tim? Feel free to just unmute yourself. One that I had was is the recall process unique to California?
No, it is not. There are other states that allow recalls, and state laws are already, California is not the only state that allows initiative, referendum, and recall. It started here, but other states have adopted that. And I'm not an expert on this, and I don't know which states have which laws, but we're seeing attempts to recall progressive officials and virtually no attempts to recall right-wing officials. Right? I have not seen any attempts recently to recall Trumpites.
Right.
They're not the ones getting recalled.
Yeah, Tim, I think your analysis is 100% correct. The initial aim of referendum initiative and recall was about popular base, people power, if you will, the role of money now in state politics, especially around initiatives, has totally transformed their meaning and their use. And you are absolutely correct in saying that the use of recalls now are very political. It is interesting to me, the recall around the school board. I looked it up in the last, since Tom Amiano was elected supervisor, the single institution from which most successful supervisors have come from have been the Board of Education. The Board of Education has produced more winning supervisor candidates than any other institution. And one wonders if the attempt to recall three school board members, which, as was pointed out by Aaron, means that the mayor will have 3 appointments to the school board, might not be a way of grooming candidates for the Board of Supervisors. I wondered.
Calvin, I think it will be. And I can't speak to anyone's political motivation. The mayor has endorsed the recall of the 3 school board members, saying that she doesn't like the way they handled the COVID situation. But there's no question that Mayor London Breed, and she has made this very clear, would like to control the school board. Way back when, until the 1960s or 70s, you remember this better than me, the school board was a city appointed commission, a mayor appointed commission. It wasn't until, I don't know, the early 70s that we changed the charter and allowed direct election of school board members. I think
up to 1930, the school district was a department of city government.
Right.
It wasn't a separate entity, governmental entity at all.
So I think the mayor, this particular mayor, would love to go back to the days when she appointed all of the members of the school board. And if this is successful, she will appoint 3. And those people will then be in a position to play on their name recognition, their fundraising ability, and all these other factors that come into play should they decide to run for supervisor. I think it will be very interesting to see the people she appoints, if this is successful, where they live. Does she carefully appoint people who live in districts where she wants to challenge the incumbent supervisor? Does she appoint someone from District 1 because she really wants to get rid of Connie Chan? Does she appoint someone who lives in District 5 so they can run against Dean Preston? If she does, that will be an indication that that is part of what she has in mind. I don't think there's any question about it. Yeah, and remember, these recalls are, for the most part, certainly with the money involved, this is not about, we can disagree. I have some disagreements with the way the school board handled the last year. Right? And I certainly have some disagreements with Allison Collins on a bunch of things, but they're all going to be up for re-election pretty soon, right? I mean, you can run against them and offer better ideas. This is not about that. This is now about flexing big money to win a victory where you couldn't win it in a normal ballot. Right? You can't. The Republicans have said very clearly, if everyone votes, we lose. This is what this whole, trying to change the way votes are counted and all of this, all of this voter suppression stuff. They have said, Republican leaders have said very clearly, if everyone votes, we lose, right? The fewer people who vote, the more likely you are to get even in San Francisco, a more conservative outcome. So I think that's what's going, not always, Kelvin, but I think we will, for example, in this February election, an awful lot of people are going to come out just to vote to recall the school board. And that is going to impact Haney, Campos, Selby, and Mahood. It's going to impact that, just the turnout, right? It would be, I think the results of this special election for state assembly would be very different if the school board recall were not also on the ballot. I mean, potentially, right? Because potentially a whole bunch of very conservative parents who want to recall the school board are going to show up and vote. And then what are they going to do on the other issues? Anyway, I've talked enough. Irene said, does the attempted Newsom recall show anything new? It shows that if you got enough money, you can put anything on the ballot. And if you got enough money, you can fight it. That's what it shows, right? I mean, Gavin Newsom was able to raise a tremendous amount of money to fight that. And a bunch of disgruntled people were able to raise enough money to pay signature gatherers to get this on the ballot. If we could if we could ban paid signature gathering, and if you actually had to get this on the ballot because people really cared, this would be a very, very different situation. I believe that under Citizens United, we can't do that, but it'd be worth a try.
Lisa, do you want to?
That actually is very timely, your comment, Tim, because that's my question is, it just seems like it should not be legal to pay signature gatherers who don't even live here to come and, and it just seems like gaming. It seems like, shooting fish in a barrel. And I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I just can't believe that's legal.
It's an industry. There are big companies now that hire signature gatherers all around the country, hire them out to local campaigns, fly them there and put them up. Right? There's people in the Boudin recall who lived in Chicago, who were flown to San Francisco and put up in hotel rooms to do this, plus paid $15 a signature. My understanding, and I'm not a lawyer either, but certainly not an election lawyer. My understanding is that thanks to the decision by the Attorney General that recalls are initiatives and not candidates, you can't limit contributions. And based on Citizens United and Buckley v. Vallejo and other Supreme Court decisions, you can't tell people they can't pay someone to gather signatures. So, I mean, I think that alone would be a phenomenal change in the way this all works, but I don't think we're going to get, certainly not with this Supreme Court, we're not going to get away with it.
Maybe one very local way would be to require that the signature gatherers live in the district or the city where the initiative would go on the ballot. I don't know, but again,
I don't know if we can do that
not
either.
a lawyer.
That's one for perhaps Supervisor Preston to take to the city attorney's office and see if there's something we can do on it. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, but Tim, I think going back to a point you made earlier was that you can't just recall somebody just because you don't like them,
right?
Or they voted the wrong way. It's got to be for some just cause.
Right. You've got, and the California Constitution is very clear. The fact that a certain number of people sign signatures is defined as just cause. You do not have to demonstrate any malfeasance. You don't have to, you can recall someone just because you don't like the way they voted on a certain issue, which is what happened to a bunch of people who've been recalled. That's what happened to Paul Horcher and Doris Allen. Their constituents didn't like the way they voted for Speaker of the State Assembly. And rather than running someone else against them in 2 years, they raised the money and did a recall. And I'm not defending either of those two particular Republicans, but that was not about malfeasance in office.
Any final questions for Tim?
Mine just might be if we think that there's corruption at the local level in this dynamic of the co-optation of our political process, do you honestly think it's any different at the federal level, or do you think it's actually a million times worse?
I think it is. It depends on what you're looking at, but I think that the money controlling politics is a problem at every level, from the local government to the state government to the federal government. There's absolutely no question about that. It happens at the state legislature, it happens at the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, and it happens in Congress and the US Senate. There's no question about that. That's a very serious problem. And as long as we have a Supreme Court that's going to support Citizens United and Buckley v. Vallejo, it's very difficult to challenge that.
Having worked on the last successful federal cases that defended campaign finance reform before the Citizens United case, I would wholeheartedly agree with that.
Yeah, yeah.
Great.
Well, thank you all. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tim. Yeah, for that history lesson, extremely thorough and enlightening. So really appreciate it. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. It's Alice says, can HANC or somebody publish it in some form? I believe that we are recording this meeting.
Yes.
If somebody wants to send me the recording, I can try to put together some type of transcript and put it somewhere.
Great. Yeah, we have our recordings and we post them to the site, and usually do a recap in our newsletter also. So
great. All right. Well, thank you for inviting me.
Great. Thank you, Tim. And thank you everyone for coming, for a great meeting. Good to see everybody.
Thank you.